So, this is The Birth of a Book from Conception Through Labor and Delivery with author of If Only, Judith Arnold.
Morning. Thank you for coming, and hooray for Zoom. I don't know how we would have survived this pandemic without Zoom. If I were Zooming from my house, I would probably have a pretty bookcase behind me and have my book prominently displayed on the shelf there. But I am actually Zooming from a writer's conference right now, so I'm just going to hold my book up every now and then so you can see it. It's a beautiful book. I'm going to start the day off with some sex education. Where do books come from? You may know the story about the kid who comes home from school one day and says, "Mommy, where did I come from?" And his mother tells him. She explains the facts of life. She explains the birds and the bees. And when she's all done, he says, "Oh, I was just wondering because Joey down the street told me he comes from Chicago." And my books do not come from Chicago. I'm sure some very good books come from Chicago, but I'm going to give you the birds and the bees about my books. I've written a lot of books. I've written a whole bunch of romance novels. I've written humorous mystery series, some women's fiction, and now I'm very happily writing general fiction for the Story Plant. And as with children, you know, some books are easy, some are more challenging, but I love them all. And I try not to play favorites, although I do have a favorite. I always have a favorite, and that's my current release, which in this case is If Only. So I'm going to give you the birds and the bees about If Only. I take long walks through my town every day, different route each day. And one of my routes takes me past a house that my husband and I seriously considered buying when we first moved to town 30 years ago. It's a lovely house, but it was lacking some features we wanted. So we ended up buying a different house in another part of town. And every time I walk past that house, I find myself wondering, if only I had bought that house instead, what would my life be like now, 30 years later? My kids would have gone to different neighborhood schools. They would have had different neighborhood playmates. I would have had different neighborhood playmates. The view from my office window would have been different. Maybe that would have affected the books I wrote. You know, we make these choices in our lives, and each time we make a choice, it affects the entire trajectory of our lives. It takes us down one path and it blocks off another path. And this idea really intrigued me. I wanted to explore it in a novel, but it was just an idea. It was an egg. It needed to be fertilized in order to come to life. I needed to find a sperm donor for my egg. And a volunteer stepped forward. His name was Walter Mitty. Some of you may be familiar with the James Thurber story, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, or you've seen the movie based on this story. Walter Mitty is a nebbish. He's a kind of an ineffectual, boring, kind of very humble guy. He lives a kind of worthless life, but he has this wild fantasy life in which he imagines himself as a renowned surgeon saving lives in an OR, or a brilliant scientist who invents something that transforms the world. And he lives these fantasies in his mind. He imagines he really is that surgeon performing the surgery, or the scientist. And he offered to be my sperm donor. So I introduced him to the house. I lit a few candles, turned on some Al Green music, closed the door, and they really hit it off. The chemistry was great. And that is how If Only was conceived. If Only is the story of a woman, a recent retiree, who's looking back on her life and thinking about the choices she made along the way and how they affected where she ended up at this point in her life. And whenever her real life gets very chaotic, she lapses into a fantasy about where she would have been, what her life would have been like if she had made a different choice here or there along the journey of her life. So you can see that there's genetic material from both parents in this book. Now, when a woman conceives an embryo, what usually happens if all goes well, she'll have morning sickness for a couple of months, and then maybe spend the next 7 months eating for 2 and watching her feet puff up and wearing really ugly maternity clothes. And then again, if all goes well, at 9 months, the fetus is as developed inside her as it's going to be, and she goes into labor and delivers that baby. With books, it's a little different. With books, from the moment of conception to the moment of delivery, it is all labor. Labor from beginning to end. It is hard work. Anyone who tells you writing a book is easy is lying. And different books, sometimes the labor is harder, sometimes it's not so bad. With If Only, it was hard work, but hard work is not necessarily unpleasant work. I really enjoyed spending time watching this story develop inside me, watching its growth and its progress. But, you know, there is one other big difference between being pregnant with a fetus and being pregnant with a book. When you're pregnant with a fetus, you try to avoid drinking caffeine and alcohol. When you are pregnant with a book, you drink vast quantities of caffeine and alcohol. But anyway, at some point, the book is as grown inside you as it's going to be. It is as developed as it can be inside you, and it is time to deliver that baby. And at this point, I'm usually so sick and tired of the book. I felt this way about my kids too, I must say. I just want it out of me. I want my life back. I want my body back. I want to be done. And so I push like a maniac. Last 10 or 12,000 words of a book, I will write them in a day or two. I just want this out of me. Now, newborn babies are very messy. Before you want to introduce them to anyone else, you want to clean them up a little. And that's very much the same with a newborn manuscript, at least for me. Mine come out pretty messy and they have to get cleaned up before I will show them to anyone. And so I will go through them paragraph by paragraph. I will evaluate every comma and question mark. I'm a heat-seeking missile when it comes to dangling participles. I am probably a stricter disciplinarian with my books than I ever was with my kids, but I am a grammar nerd and I just go through that thing and clean it up as best I can. But eventually, it's time to show your baby around. And an unacknowledged truth about babies is that they are not all gorgeous. Some babies are pretty funny looking. In fact, a surprising number of babies actually look like Winston Churchill. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but they do. But you show them to your loved ones and your good friends, and they all say, "Oh, he's beautiful. She's adorable. What a cutie." And they say this because they are your good friends. Your editor is not your good friend, and he's not going to say that if it's not true. But If Only was as cleaned up as I could get it, and so I sent it to my editor with great trepidation and braced myself for the possibility that he would read it and say, you know, stick a cigar in his mouth that looks like Winston Churchill. But he didn't. He read it and he said, "It's beautiful." Now, it still was not ready to go out into the world. It had to grow up, had to get an education, finishing school. I like to think of this. It needed some polish. It needed some more editing, proofreading, needed to learn how to present itself to the world, cover art, jacket copy, font size, front and back matter, all that stuff. But it passed all its courses with flying colors, straight A student, and it is scheduled to graduate again on October 19th. It's the release date, graduating magna cum laude, if I can brag a little as a mom, and it will go out into the world. And here I think is the biggest similarity between being a parent of children and being a parent of a book. When parents send their children out into the world, I think most parents harbor the hope that their children will make the world a better place in some way, make someone happy, help someone in need, you know, contribute something, love and receive love. And I feel the same way about my books. When I send them out into the world, I hope they'll make the world a little better place. They'll make someone laugh. They'll make a reader cry, cathartic tears. They'll make a reader think about the world around them, think about themselves, give them some insights, just somehow make the world a little bit better. Back when I mentioned that I wrote a lot of romance novels. Back when I used to write them, and it's true even today to some extent, but especially then, romance novels were really, they were regarded with contempt. They were considered trash. They were considered junk, silly little books. People would say, "When are you going to write a real book?" But obviously, I never thought that of them. I wouldn't have been writing them if I thought they were junk. I always saw them as subversive feminist tracts. They were about female empowerment. They were stories in which the heroine got to create her own narrative rather than being the adjunct of some hero's narrative. And the heroines were resourceful and intelligent and independent, and they were loved because of that. in spite of it. But anyway, when I was in the thick of my romance writing career, my sister was being treated for breast cancer. And she would go to the hospital every week for her chemotherapy. And the hospital had a kind of a dedicated area just for breast cancer patients. So they were all women in there. And she would go in, and all the women would be sitting in their infusion chairs getting their chemotherapy drips. And this was in the era before smartphones and tablets. So they were all reading books while they got their chemo. And my sister said almost all of them were reading romance novels. And I thought, I am writing books that help cancer patients get through their chemotherapy. And I think about that every day, whatever kind of book I'm writing, whether it's general fiction or anything. I always think, is this book going to help someone get through chemotherapy? I think If Only will help people get through chemotherapy. I think I have great hopes for this book. I'm very ambitious for this book. I think it will make the world a better place. I think it will make readers laugh. There's a lot of very funny stuff in it. It probably makes some readers sigh or maybe even cry a few tears. It will definitely make them think about the choices they've made in their own lives and whether they made the right choices, where they would be right now if they'd made different choices. And it'll give them insights and make them relate to the world in a different way. And so that is how If Only came into existence. I'll show it to you again because I don't have the bookcase behind me. And now I'll take questions.
Okay, well, I guess I'll start with a question. So you explained how the idea for If Only came to you and how you kind of like labored over the book, but do you have any idea of like how many like different versions of like drafting did you go through?
I usually only write one very rough draft and then I clean it up in the cleanup stage. I do, well, usually when I'm about a third of the way into the book, I send it to my editor and get his input at that point. You know, it's kind of like visiting your OBGYN or your midwife and having her say, well, you really should be consuming more protein. He made a few suggestions and I did have to go back. I do, as I'm writing, I will frequently go back. Part for me, writing is a process of discovery. And as the character grows, I suddenly say, oh, wait, she is actually doing X. I have to go back now into the early chapter and make sure that I set it up properly so that she can do X in this later chapter. But when it comes out, that's it as far as the main draft goes. Then I will go through it on the computer and clean it up. Then I will print it out and I will go through it in a hard copy because things tend to read differently in a hard copy. And I go through it with different colored pens because I'm a little bit, OCD and, mark things up with different colored pens. And then I go and key in all those changes. Then I will read it one final time on the computer. And then I will take a very deep breath and say a prayer and send it to my editor. So it's like one draft, but multiple times going through that draft. So.
Yeah, I asked that question because I write personally as well, and I always struggle with like getting past like the first few pages because as I'm writing, I'll like write a sentence and I'll stare at it and I go delete and I'll write it again. Like I should probably move forward,
Well, I think we do tend to spend more time writing that first sentence than any other sentence in the entire book. I do that too. It's kind of like, I guess it's like, I'm not a sprinter, but you watch these racers in the Olympics or something, and if they don't get off the block just right, they know that the race is lost, so they spend more time practicing how they're going to, respond to the pistol shot. And, the technique comes later, but yeah, you have to I sometimes have to just say, leave it. You can go back and fix it later. But yeah, I spend a lot of time fussing over that first paragraph. I'll usually spend a couple of days just on the first paragraph and then I'll say enough, move on. So that's pretty normal, I think.
Awesome. Well, do we have any other questions? All right, that's fine. I'll ask a question again. Let's see. Do you, like your family members, do they know when you're writing a book and do they like keep asking to see pages?
They don't ask to see pages. They must know when I'm writing a book because that's when they come and bother me. They, I know a lot of my writer friends who will close the door on their office when they are writing, and I have never been able to do that. I always wanted my kids to be able to wander in and out. Um, and my kids include my husband. He's my big kid with the mustache, but he wanders in and out too. And it drives me crazy. And I snap at them and I say, oh, you've just broken my train of thought. It's going to take me an hour to get back into the groove. But they they read some of my books. I have sons and they have always been very squeamish about reading any of my romances. They do not want to read a sex scene mommy wrote. But they have read my mysteries. They enjoy my mysteries. My husband read about half of my romance novels and then said, do I have to keep reading them or will you divorce me if I stop reading them? Because he likes to read action adventure stuff and historical fiction and nonfiction. But he did enjoy the mysteries a lot. I don't let them read my books while they're in progress because I don't let anyone, I don't have a critique group or anything like that. I don't want anyone touching my baby but me. My husband, when he reads one of my books, he will usually find some little thing that I messed up. I had in one of my books once, I had some characters discussing the Harvard-Yale football game and it was book set in October and my husband said, what are you crazy? The Harvard-Yale game is always played in November. Why would they be discussing it in October? I did not know this. He told me I should always check with him if I'm ever going to make any football references from there on in. I have. He said, you're going to get so many letters from readers saying, you crazy person you had. And I didn't hear from a single reader saying, why did you have him discussing the Harvard? But, he looks for different things in a book. No, they are very respectful of the fact that their mom is a writer, and they try not to bother me too much. And again, now that I'm not writing romances anymore, they are much more open to reading my books. So, and I will say, my daughter-in-law is great; she reads my books. So I finally have another female in the family, so she reads my books.
That's great. I can definitely sympathize with the people walking in and asking to see what you're doing. You're like, no, go away.
Yes.
Do we have any other questions? Anyone else? You can even put the questions in the chat and I can read them to Judith if you don't feel like speaking. And no question is too small.
I can show you my pretty book again.
I know, I love that cover.
It's a beautiful cover, and the Story Plant gave me some input into it, which was really nice. They came up with the original artwork, but I didn't like the way it was cropped. Mm-hmm. So I pulled out my Photoshop and cropped it differently, and they said, oh, that looks better. And then we added the butterfly, and the butterfly is an important image in the story because I don't know if you know the myth about how if a butterfly flaps its wings in Asia, there'll be a tornado in America. And the heroine in her present life, when she's not lapsing into her fantasies, she feels her life is pretty chaotic, and she keeps thinking, oh, some butterfly in Vietnam is flapping its wings right now, and that's when my life feels like a tornado. So we added the butterfly. See it right there.
Yeah, so cute.
So, that's where that came from.
Yeah, no, I love it. Let's see if I have any other questions. Have you ever had a story idea that you followed through to a certain number of pages and you just went, this is not going to work?
Yes, those are my miscarriages. Yes, I have had quite a few. It's very sad. It's frustrating. It's disappointing, but you grieve and then you let it go. I have drawers full of them. Some books are just not viable. Book I'm working on now is coming along fine, but the project I started just before it, the labor was excruciating. It was so painful, and after a couple of months, I sent what I had to my editor and we discussed it. He's like my midwife, and we just said, no, this is not viable. This book is not going to survive, and we had to terminate it. It's sad, but yes, yeah. And but I never throw anything out. You never know. Maybe we are allowed to plagiarize ourselves, not anyone else, but ourselves, and maybe some idea that was in there, I can use it in something else someday. So.
Yeah, maybe put the voice or something, use it somewhere else.
Yeah, or just some character that I really, really liked, and I'll just pluck that character out of that story and plant him in another story and see what happens. So.
All right. Let's see if I have a final question. Do you have a favorite, like, what if from your story that you can share with us?
I live in the world of what ifs. That's what writers do. Every book starts with the question, what if? And then you spin it off from there. My favorite what if about this book, of course, is what if it becomes a mega bestseller, and what will I do with all the money? But I don't really care about the money as much as I care about it reaching readers. That's always been my big thing. Writing is a way that I can communicate with the world. It's pretty much the only way I know how to communicate with the world. I'm kind of an introvert, so I wanted to reach people. I think people will just really respond to it. I think book clubs are just going to love it, frankly, because it'll give us all a chance to talk about our own if onlys and our own choices. And obviously, while I was writing this, the idea of the book, it is real. I passed that house, and I do think that every Wednesday I pass that house, and I think about some of the challenges my kids face. And it's kind of crazy thinking, but both my kids at one time were facing very, very serious illnesses. And so I think, well, if only we had bought this house, they would never have got sick. Of course, they're both in good health now. Thank goodness, but they got great medical care and they're fine now. But you wonder these things. If only I had moved into that house, maybe I would have started writing mysteries sooner. Or you wonder, as a writer, I always wonder what kind of life is going on inside every house I pass. What are they experiencing? What is their narrative? I don't know if that answers your question, but it's one of my favorite games, is just to imagine if only I had done this, if only I had wound up being very tall and thin, would I have been a fashion model instead of a writer? if only my hair weren't so frizzy, what would my life be like? So I do that all the time.
Yeah, that definitely answers my question. JJ was wondering if there are any tips for getting conversation to be more natural in writing, like dialogue tips.
Well, I actually, before I started writing fiction, I spent about 10 years working as a playwright. And it was just a kind of a weird detour. I always knew I was going to be a writer, but in college, there was this really cool guy who was teaching playwriting. So I said, I got to take a class with him. And I ended up working in the theater for about 10 years. And that was the best training for writing dialogue in the world. I mean, people constantly tell me how great my dialogue is. And I think, yeah, that's because I wrote plays for 10 years. When you write plays, you have to learn how to tell the story through dialogue, basically. You don't have long stretches of introspection and explaining what characters are thinking. You have to show everything, because it's a very visual and audible art form, communication form. So I would suggest that every writer who struggles with dialogue, try writing some plays, just for practice. You don't have to go trekking to some regional theater and trying to get a production, but write play scripts and just learn how to tell stories through dialogue, through the actual characters' dialogue, and you reveal character through their dialogue too. I think that really helps. The other suggestion for making natural dialogue is to listen to the way people talk. Just, be a good listener. And when I was younger and I lived in and around New York City, I'd go sit on a subway train and listen to the conversations around me, just to get the rhythm of the speech and hear how people express themselves. When I'm writing a younger character, there's a character in If Only who's a 14-year-old teenager, I'll go out and hang out by the high school and just listen to my neighbor's kids or something, because my kids are not in high school anymore. But just listen to the word patterns, the way people speak. And yeah, I think writing play scripts or even little skits, just where you have to tell the story through dialogue, is a really good training skill.
Yes, I really agree with that. I always listen into conversations in public, and when people call me nosy, I'm just like, I'm doing research. What are you talking about?
My husband says I get the look. He says he can tell a little tape recorder is just switched on in my head and I'm recording everything. And he knows me very well, obviously. So he knows, like, we'll go to a party and, sometimes we'll go to a party and I'll meet someone for the first time. I say, oh, what do you do? And I say, well, I write novels, and they'll suddenly fall very silent, like, oh, what did I just tell her? But other times, I keep my mouth shut. I won't tell them what I do, and I'll just listen to them and ask them probing questions and get all kinds of ideas. And yeah, the world is full of ideas. It's a wonderful place.
Yes, definitely. Well, this has been a great conversation. This has been The Birth of a Book from Conception Through Labor to Delivery with author of If Only, Judith Arnold. We're really happy to have everyone, and we hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.